The blood on my hands isn't mine. I'm lying in what used to be our communications bunker, and I can hear them, 60, maybe 70 Taliban fighters circling our position like wolves around wounded prey. It's 3 a.m. on the second night, and the temperature has dropped to 15 degrees. I've been awake for 41 hours straight. My right shoulder is dislocated from when the mortar hit. I have 3 magazines left. The radio is destroyed. And 6 feet behind me, Corporal Danny Rodriguez from Texas is bleeding out from a sucking chest wound that I've packed with torn pieces of my own shirt. He keeps whispering his daughter's name. She just turned 4 last week. He showed me the pictures on his phone before the attack started, before everything went to hell, before the choice became simple: stay and probably die, or leave and definitely live with the fact that I abandoned my brothers. I can hear Captain Morrison on the upper level. He's still firing, which means he's still breathing. That's something, that's everything. The enemy knows we're down to maybe 8 functional soldiers out of the 23 who were here when the sun came up yesterday morning. They know our ammunition is running critical. They know rescue won't come for at least another 6 hours, because the helicopters can't fly in this valley at night, not with those shoulder-fired missiles they brought up from Pakistan. They know all of this. What they don't know is that I've spent the last 17 hours doing something that every tactical manual would call insane. I've been moving between positions, firing from different angles, changing my voice, creating the illusion that there are still 15 or 20 of us combat ready. I've been playing the most dangerous game of psychological warfare, making them believe that this outpost is still a fortress when it's really just a tomb that 8 men refuse to leave. The crazy part? It's working. The attacks are getting more cautious, more hesitant. They're scared of ghosts, and I learned this trick from the most unlikely place, a documentary about the Battle of Thermopylae I watched during my last leave. Sometimes history teaches you things that no training manual ever could. Sometimes the only way to survive is to make your enemy believe the impossible. My name is Marcus Chen. I'm 35 years old now, and this is the story of how 8 soldiers held a position that intelligence said could never be held, how we turned desperation into strategy, and how 47 hours taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's what you do when fear is the only thing you have left. If my story resonates with you, please hit the like button to bring a little light to this father's heart. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss my upcoming life stories, and tell me in the comments where you're watching this video from and what time it is there right now. It makes me so happy to know what corner of the country or world you're listening from. Let me take you back to where this started, because you need to understand what we were up against. It was October 2011, and I was serving my second deployment in Afghanistan, stationed at what we called Outpost Viper, a collection of reinforced bunkers and sandbag walls perched on a mountainside in the Kunar province. This wasn't some major strategic location. We were basically a tripwire, an early warning system positioned to monitor Taliban movement through the valley below. 23 soldiers, mostly infantry, a few support personnel, stuck on a mountain that the Afghans called the place where eagles die, because the air was so thin even the birds struggled. The nearest major base was 40 minutes away by helicopter, and the roads were so mined and ambushed that ground support was basically suicide. We knew we were exposed. What we didn't know was that we'd been selected for something else entirely, a coordinated assault designed to prove that the Taliban could still strike American positions at will, to send a message that no matter how much technology we had, they owned these mountains. Intelligence later told us that between 60 and 80 fighters had been positioning themselves around our outpost for 3 days, bringing in heavy weapons, mortars, RPGs, and enough ammunition for a sustained siege. They weren't planning a quick raid. They were planning to erase us from the map. I was 28 years old then, a sergeant who'd grown up in San Francisco, helping my parents run their small restaurant in Chinatown. I'd joined the army because I wanted to serve, wanted to prove something to myself about who I was, beyond the expectations of family and community. I was good at my job, not the strongest soldier, not the fastest, but I had something else. I was methodical. I noticed patterns. I remembered details. My platoon used to joke that I had a photographic memory for tactical situations, They didn't know how right they were, and they didn't know how much that quirk would matter when everything fell apart. The assault began at dawn on a Tuesday. I remember the exact time because I was checking my watch when the first mortar round hit, 6:47 a.m. The explosion tore through our eastern wall and killed Private Johnson instantly. He was 19 years old from Alabama, and he'd been in country for exactly 23 days. I saw him laugh at a joke 30 seconds before the impact. That's how fast it happened. That's how fast everything changed. Within the first hour, they hit us with everything they had. Mortars walking across our position, RPG fire from multiple directions, machine gun fire so intense it sounded like a continuous roar of thunder. We returned fire, called for air support, activated our defense plan, standard procedure. Professional responses to a known threat. But then the radio operator took shrapnel through the neck, and our primary communications went down. And then Lieutenant Patterson got hit leading a counterattack on the southern perimeter. And then the mortars found our ammunition storage, and we lost 40% of our ordnance in a fireball that I felt in my bones from 100 feet away. By noon on that first day, we'd gone from 23 soldiers to 16 combat-effective personnel. Captain Morrison, our commanding officer, was still functional but had taken shrapnel in his leg. Half our heavy weapons were destroyed, and the attacks just kept coming in waves. Aggressive probing attacks followed by massive fire superiority, then a pause, then more attacks. They were professional. They were patient. They knew we couldn't sustain this, and they were willing to spend ammunition and time to break us down systematically. I remember thinking during one of the pauses that this felt different from every other firefight I'd experienced. This wasn't opportunistic, this was planned execution. This was personal. What I didn't know then was that this was exactly the moment when I'd have to become someone different, when the training would stop being enough and something else would have to take over, something improvised, something desperate, something that would make the difference between a footnote in military history and a story of impossible survival. The sun was setting on that first day when Corporal Rodriguez got hit. We'd been fighting for 12 hours straight. I was exhausted, running on adrenaline and fear when I heard him scream. He'd been manning a position on our western flank when an RPG hit close enough to throw him against a wall. The blast had created a pressure wave that collapsed part of his chest cavity. I got to him within seconds, saw the blood, saw his eyes going wide with panic, and I did what training taught me. Applied pressure, called for the medic, tried to keep him conscious and calm. But our medic, Specialist Kim, was already working on 3 other casualties. We were running out of supplies, running out of time, running out of options. That's when Captain Morrison pulled me aside and said something that I'll never forget. His exact words were, "Chen, we're going to get hit hard tonight. They're going to try to overrun us when it gets dark. We've got maybe 8-10 guys who can still fight effectively. I'm going to call for evacuation, but it won't get here until tomorrow morning at the earliest. We need to hold this position for at least another 12 hours, probably longer. I need you to think creatively here. We can't win a straight fight with what we have left. So how do we not fight straight?" He looked at me with this intensity that was part desperation, part challenge. He was asking me to solve an impossible equation. He was asking me to do something that our training had never covered, because our training assumed you'd always have support, always have resources, always have options. But we had none of those things. We had exhaustion and dwindling ammunition and wounded soldiers who couldn't be moved. We had a position that was indefensible by conventional standards, and we had me, with my weird brain that remembered random things, standing there trying to figure out how to keep us alive. That's when I remembered the documentary. 3 months earlier, during my leave, I'd been up late at night in a hotel room, couldn't sleep, and I'd stumbled across this History Channel program about ancient battles. They covered Thermopylae, and I'd watched it mostly because I had nothing else to do. But there was this one segment that stuck with me, how the 300 Spartans used the narrow pass not just as a defensive position, but as a psychological weapon. How they rotated their fighters to always appear fresh. How they made noise to seem more numerous. How they turned their tactical disadvantage into a mental advantage by making the Persian army believe they were facing something supernatural, something that couldn't be broken by ordinary means. The historian being interviewed said something that echoed in my head. They didn't win by being stronger. They won by making their enemy doubt reality. That phrase hit me like a physical impact. Making the enemy doubt reality. We couldn't match their numbers. We couldn't match their firepower. But maybe, just maybe, we could make them doubt what they were seeing. I laid out my idea to Captain Morrison in quick, urgent sentences. We had 8 positions around the outpost. The main bunker, 3 reinforced fighting positions, 2 observation posts, the communications tower, and a fallback position near our supplies. Currently, we were trying to man all of them with our remaining soldiers, spreading ourselves thin, reacting to their attacks. What if instead we abandoned that approach entirely? What if I rotated between positions every 10 or 15 minutes, firing from different angles, using different weapons when possible, creating the impression that each position was fully manned? What if we used our remaining smoke grenades not to cover movement, but to create confusion about where fire was coming from? What if we set up our remaining radios to play recordings of military chatter, making it sound like we were coordinating with units that didn't exist? What if we turned our weakness, the fact that we were few, into an advantage by making them uncertain about our actual strength? Morrison stared at me for a long 10 seconds. Then he said, "That's either brilliant or completely insane, probably both. Do it. I'll coordinate the wounded and maintain central position with whoever can still shoot straight. You become our ghost army. Make them think twice about every attack. Make them hesitate. Buy us time." He gripped my shoulder hard enough to hurt, and I saw in his eyes that he knew this was desperate, knew that conventional tactics had already failed us, knew that we were betting everything on psychological warfare executed by one exhausted sergeant with a strange idea. But we were out of conventional options, and sometimes the only choice left is the crazy one. So I became a ghost. I became 8 soldiers. I became 15. I moved through that outpost like I was haunted by my own multiplication. I'd fire a burst from the northern position using an M4, then sprint low through connecting trenches to the eastern post, and fire the M240 machine gun in controlled bursts, different rhythm, different sound signature. Then to the southern observation post with an M16 I'd taken from a wounded soldier, firing single shots like a designated marksman. Then back to the communications tower with my personal weapon, spraying suppressive fire. Every position had to sound different, had to feel like a different soldier with different tactics. I changed my voice when I shouted orders, sometimes high and urgent, sometimes low and commanding, sometimes with a southern accent I'd picked up from soldiers I'd served with, sometimes with the flat tones of Midwest America. I made it sound like sergeants were coordinating with privates, like officers were directing fire, like we had a fully functional chain of command managing multiple fighting positions. The first night was when it really got tested. They came at us hard around 2 a.m., expecting us to be exhausted and broken. They hit the western wall with concentrated RPG fire, trying to blow a hole they could exploit. I was in the eastern position when it started, so I opened up with the machine gun, long sustained bursts that suggested multiple weapons firing. Then I used smoke grenades to cover my movement, sprinted through our destroyed communications bunker, came up in the southern position, and started firing single shots toward their probable advance route, making it sound like we had a sniper still active. Then to the northern post, where I threw a fragmentation grenade and followed it up with rifle fire, creating the impression of a coordinated defense from multiple angles. I was running on pure adrenaline, my muscles screaming, my lungs burning in the thin mountain air, but I kept moving because stopping meant dying, and dying meant leaving Rodriguez and the others to face whatever came next. The thing about psychological warfare is that it works both ways. You're not just trying to deceive the enemy. You're also trying to convince yourself that the deception might actually work, that your desperate improvisation might buy enough time for reality to change. And somewhere during that endless night, moving from position to position, firing until my shoulders ached and my ears rang with permanent tinnitus, I started to believe it was working. Their attacks were becoming less coordinated. They were hesitating. They were putting more fire into empty positions, suggesting they weren't sure where we actually were. They were acting like they were facing a competent defensive force instead of 8 exhausted soldiers held together by desperation and stubbornness. But here's what they don't tell you about sustained combat. It's not like the movies where adrenaline keeps you sharp and focused for hours. Real combat fatigue is cumulative and crushing. By the time the sun came up on the second day, I'd been moving and fighting for 24 hours straight. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely change magazines. My vision was getting blurry. I was making mistakes. Simple things like forgetting which position I'd just left or which weapon I'd already emptied. Captain Morrison saw me stumbling during one of my transitions and pulled me into the main bunker. He handed me a canteen, made me drink, made me eat an MRE energy bar that tasted like cardboard and dust. He said, "You're keeping us alive, Chen, but if you collapse, this whole thing falls apart. 5-minute break. That's an order." 5 minutes felt like both an eternity and an instant. I sat there shaking, and I could hear Rodriguez in the corner, his breathing wet and labored, and Specialist Davis, who'd taken a bullet through his thigh and couldn't walk, and Private Wilson, who'd been partially deafened by a close explosion. These were my brothers. These were the people I'd shared meals with, complained about officers with, laughed with during the rare moments when Afghanistan felt like anything other than a combat zone. And they were depending on me to keep moving, to keep the illusion alive, to buy enough time for rescue to arrive. Morrison was watching me with this expression that mixed gratitude and guilt, grateful I was doing this, guilty for asking me to do it. He said quietly, "Rescue's been pushed back. Helicopters can't get clearance until tonight at the earliest. Weather's turning bad. We need another 12 hours minimum." 12 hours. I'd already been at this for 24. My body was telling me it couldn't do 12 more. My mind was telling me that at some point the Taliban would figure out what we were doing, would realize they outnumbered us by a factor of 10 to 1, would simply rush our positions and overwhelm us through sheer mass. But my brothers were watching me, waiting to see if I'd break, and I couldn't let them see that I was terrified, that I was running on fumes, that I was one bad moment away from complete collapse. So I stood up. I grabbed my rifle. I said, 12 hours, no problem, they haven't figured it out yet. And I went back out into the maze of trenches and fighting positions, back into the performance of being multiple soldiers, back into the exhausting work of making the enemy doubt reality. The second day brought new challenges. They'd brought up a heavy machine gun during the night, positioned it on a ridge about 800 meters away, and they were using it to suppress our positions with devastating accuracy. Every time I moved, I had to time it between their firing patterns, had to use the destroyed sections of our outpost as cover, had to risk exposure for seconds at a time. I took a piece of shrapnel across my right shoulder during one transition, not deep enough to be critical, but enough to make every movement a reminder of how close I was to getting killed. The pain was sharp and constant, but I couldn't stop to treat it properly, because stopping meant losing the momentum, losing the illusion, giving them time to reorganize and realize how few we actually were. Around midday on the second day, something changed. I was in the eastern position, about to move to the northern post, when I heard voices. Taliban fighters talking to each other, close enough that I could hear the uncertainty in their tones, even though I couldn't understand the language. They were arguing about something. Then one of them shouted something that sounded like a question, and another responded with what sounded like frustration. I realized they were trying to figure out our exact numbers, trying to reconcile what they were seeing. Fire from multiple positions, different weapons, different tactics, with their intelligence that told them this was a small outpost with limited personnel. They were doubting, they were hesitating. The deception was working at a level I hadn't even hoped for. They weren't just uncertain, they were actually scared that they'd underestimated us, that we had reinforcements they didn't know about, that this was a trap instead of a desperate last stand. I exploited that hesitation. I started using the captured Taliban radio we'd recovered during an earlier patrol, broadcasting fake communications in broken Pashto, phrases I'd learned from our interpreters, military terminology mixed with just enough authentic-sounding chatter to suggest we were coordinating with nearby units. I had no idea if it made actual sense to a native speaker, but the goal wasn't perfection, it was confusion. It was making them question their intelligence, making them second-guess their assault plans, making them wonder if attacking us was worth the cost they were paying. And the cost was real. We'd been taking shots of opportunity, and in 40 hours of sustained combat, we'd confirmed at least 12 Taliban casualties. That doesn't sound like much, but for a force that expected to overwhelm us easily. Every casualty made them recalculate. Every hour we held made their victory more expensive. Every indication that we might be stronger than they thought made their commanders hesitate to commit to a full assault. But you can only run on adrenaline and desperation for so long before your body starts to fail in ways you can't control. Around hour 38, I started hallucinating. Just small things at first, movement in my peripheral vision that wasn't there, sounds that didn't match reality. Then it got worse. I'd move to a position and forget why I was there. I'd pick up a weapon and my hands wouldn't cooperate properly. I dropped a magazine during a reload and watched it fall in slow motion, and I couldn't make my fingers work fast enough to catch it. Morrison saw me struggling and did something I'll never forget. He stood up, exposed himself to fire, and took over one of the positions I'd been rotating through. He basically said without words that he wouldn't let me carry this alone anymore. That if I was going to die doing this, he was going to die alongside me. That gesture, that small act of solidarity, somehow gave me enough strength to keep going. The second night was worse than the first. They launched a major assault around midnight, coordinated fire from multiple positions, and they tried to rush our southern wall where they thought we were weakest. I was in 3 different positions within 2 minutes, firing, moving, firing, creating the impression of a coordinated defense that didn't exist. My shoulder was screaming where the shrapnel had hit. My lungs felt like they were full of broken glass from breathing the cold mountain air at altitude. My fingers were numb from the cold and the constant recoil, but I kept firing because Rodriguez was still alive behind me, still breathing, still holding on, and every minute I bought him was another minute he might survive, another minute closer to rescue, another minute where his daughter might still grow up with a father. At hour 43, they tried something different. They went quiet, completely silent, no fire, no movement, nothing. It was the most terrifying thing I'd experienced in the entire siege, because silence meant they were planning something, meant they were reorganizing, meant they might have figured out our deception. I stayed frozen in position, rifle ready, scanning the darkness, listening for any sound that might telegraph their next move. Minutes passed like hours. I could hear my own heartbeat, could hear the wounded soldiers breathing in the bunker behind me, could hear the wind moving through the destroyed equipment around our outpost. And then I heard it. Movement to the west, careful and coordinated, multiple fighters advancing under the cover of darkness and silence. They were trying to infiltrate, trying to get close enough to overrun us before we could respond. This was the moment. This was when they'd either discover we were far fewer than they thought, or when our deception would hold one more time. I made a decision that was part training, part instinct, and part desperate prayer. I grabbed every remaining smoke grenade we had, 6 in total, and I threw them all at once toward the area where I'd heard movement. Then I opened up with every weapon I could reach, firing from multiple positions in rapid succession, making it sound like we'd detected their infiltration and were responding with overwhelming force. I shouted commands in English, loud enough for them to hear, coordinating imaginary units to respond to the threat. I fired flares into the sky, illuminating the valley, exposing their advance. And then something incredible happened. They broke. They retreated in disarray, falling back to their previous positions. Their careful infiltration turned into a chaotic withdrawal. They'd committed significant forces to that advance, and when they met what seemed like a prepared and numerous defense, they assumed we'd been waiting for them, that their plan had been compromised, that attacking us head-on was too costly. That withdrawal bought us 4 more hours. 4 hours where they regrouped, where they argued among themselves about tactics, where their confidence continued to erode. And during those 4 hours, I finally let myself stop moving. I collapsed in the main bunker next to Rodriguez, and Captain Morrison told me that rescue was confirmed for dawn. Helicopters were inbound, medevac was standing by. We just had to hold until sunrise. Just a few more hours. Rodriguez reached out with a bloody hand and grabbed my wrist, and he whispered, "Thank you, brother. My daughter gets to know her dad because of you." I couldn't respond. I just held his hand and tried not to think about how close we'd come to none of us making it. How many times in the past 2 days I should have been killed. How the only thing standing between 23 families getting notification letters and getting their soldiers back was a desperate gamble that psychological warfare could substitute for actual strength. The final assault came just before dawn, at hour 46. They knew time was running out. They knew helicopters would come with the light. They threw everything they had left at us: mortars, RPGs, machine gun fire, a full coordinated assault on multiple positions simultaneously. This was their last chance to achieve their objective, to prove they could destroy an American outpost, to make their casualties worth something. And I was out of tricks. I was out of ammunition in half our positions. I was out of energy, out of adrenaline, out of everything except the stubborn refusal to let them win. Morrison and I and the 6 other soldiers who could still fight took positions, and we did the only thing left. We held. We fired back with what we had. We made every round count. We shouted and screamed and refused to break because breaking meant dying, and dying meant we'd failed our brothers. The rescue helicopters arrived at hour 47, just as the sun was breaking over the mountains. Apache gunships came in low and fast, their cannons turning the Taliban positions into dust and fire. Chinook transport helicopters touched down in our ruined outpost, and medics poured out, and I remember hands grabbing me, voices asking if I was hit, and I couldn't answer because my voice was gone from shouting commands for 2 days straight. They loaded Rodriguez first, then the other wounded, then Morrison, who refused to leave until every soldier was accounted for. I was the last one on the helicopter, and as we lifted off I looked down at Outpost Viper, at the destroyed walls, at the crater-marked earth, at the positions I'd rotated through endlessly, at the ground that held the blood of soldiers who hadn't made it. And I thought about how close we'd come to all of us dying there, how a documentary about ancient history and a desperate idea had been the difference between survival and annihilation. Rodriguez survived. They got him to a field hospital within an hour, stabilized his chest, flew him to Germany for surgery and eventually back to the States. He recovered enough to see his daughter grow up, to walk her to school, to be the father she deserved. Captain Morrison received the Silver Star for his leadership during the siege. 5 other soldiers received Bronze Stars for valor. And me? They gave me the Distinguished Service Cross, second only to the Medal of Honor, for what they called extraordinary heroism in combat. The citation talked about my actions holding the position, about the deception tactics, about the psychological warfare that kept a superior enemy force at bay for 47 hours. But the medal sits in a box in my closet because I don't need a piece of metal to remember what happened. I remember it every time I close my eyes. I remember the weight of every decision, the face of every soldier I helped save, the exhaustion that went beyond physical into something existential. Looking back now, 12 years later, I understand something about war that I couldn't see clearly when I was living through it. Courage isn't about not being afraid. It's not about being strong enough or skilled enough or brave enough. Real courage is about what you choose when every option feels impossible, when staying means probable death and leaving means certain guilt, when the only thing separating you from complete collapse is the knowledge that other people are depending on you to hold on for just 1 more hour, 1 more minute, 1 more second. I was terrified for those entire 47 hours. My hands shook, my voice cracked, my body tried to quit on me multiple times. But I didn't leave. None of us did. Because we'd made a promise to each other that goes deeper than any oath or any flag. The promise that you don't abandon your brothers when things get hard. You don't calculate the odds and make the rational decision to save yourself. You stay, you fight, you refuse to let them die alone. The Taliban fighters who survived that siege later told interrogators that they'd believed they were facing 30 or more American soldiers, that they'd been convinced we had reinforcements they couldn't see, that the psychological impact of not knowing our true strength had made them hesitate at crucial moments. They said they'd never encountered defenders who seemed to be everywhere at once, who refused to break under sustained assault, who turned an indefensible position into a fortress through sheer determination. They didn't know that it was mostly one exhausted sergeant running between positions, playing a desperate game of deception, betting everything on the hope that uncertainty could substitute for actual strength. They didn't know how close we came to failing, how many times I almost collapsed, how much of our survival depended on luck and timing and the enemy's own doubts. If there's a lesson in this story, it's that sometimes the impossible situations we face, in combat, in life, in moments where everything seems lost, aren't about having the perfect solution or the overwhelming advantage. Sometimes it's about refusing to accept that the situation is impossible, about finding the unconventional approach that nobody expects, about making the enemy doubt what they think they know. Those 8 soldiers held Outpost Viper not because we were the strongest or the best equipped or the most prepared. We held it because we refused to leave each other behind, because we found a way to turn our weakness into uncertainty in the enemy's mind, and because 47 hours of sustained determination proved more powerful than superior numbers and firepower. We held it because when the only options left are surrender or stubbornness, sometimes stubbornness is enough. We held it because we were brothers, and brothers don't leave each other to die alone on a mountain in Afghanistan. That's not heroism in the traditional sense. It's just the simple, brutal truth that some promises are more important than survival, and some fights are worth staying in even when every rational part of your brain is screaming at you to run.